Why does God talk about thrones, lambs, and fire instead of just explaining himself? Because infinite truth can't fit into human sentences. So he paints pictures. Every biblical image is a bridge between human experience and divine reality. So, we're going to talk about when ancient writers tried describing heaven. Most people assume metaphorical language in Scripture represents a compromise, a concession to human limitation. They're wrong. Metaphor isn't what happens when literal language fails. It's the only way human minds can grasp transcendent reality at all. Biblical writers faced an impossible problem. How do you describe a place with no spatial dimensions? How do you communicate about disembodied spirits when every word in your vocabulary is rooted in physical experience? You can't describe heaven's latitude and longitude. There isn't any. You can't map the spiritual realm using physical coordinates. It doesn't work that way. So ancient writers did something sophisticated. They built cognitive bridges. The mechanics, then, of metaphorical thinking are built into this. When a biblical writer describes God's throne, something specific happens in the reader's mind. The brain starts with a concrete anchor, a throne, right? Something familiar from earthly experience. Everyone in the ancient Near East knew what thrones meant: authority, governance, order, the center of royal power. Then the mind performs what cognitive scientists call cross-domain mapping. It takes the functional qualities of an earthly throne and extends them into the spiritual realm. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson proved in their groundbreaking work that conceptual metaphor isn't just poetic decoration. It's how human cognition actually works. We understand abstract concepts by mapping them onto concrete physical experiences. Always. The biblical writers weren't dumbing things down for simple minds. They were using the only cognitive tool available for communicating transcendent reality. Research in embodied cognition shows that even our most abstract thinking depends on metaphorical extensions from physical experience. Our brains are wired this way. When Scripture describes God's throne, it's not suggesting a literal chair exists somewhere in space. It's creating a cognitive pathway from known authority structures to divine sovereignty. The metaphor works because it preserves the literal foundation while expanding the meaning infinitely beyond it. So, the Bible is more than literal, but never less. Right? This is a guideline for you. Here's where most readers get confused. They think metaphorical language means not really true. That calling something metaphorically diminishes its reality. The opposite is true. Consider Isaiah 53. The suffering servant described as a lamb, silent before its shearers. The literal image provides the foundation, an actual lamb, innocent, meek, unable to defend itself. But the metaphor doesn't stop there. It opens into theological depths that literal transcription could never reach. Sacrifice, substitution, unjust suffering willingly endured. The entire framework of atonement theology emerges from this single image. The metaphor carries the full weight of its literal foundation. A lamb really is innocent and vulnerable. Then it expands that meaning to communicate spiritual realities that transcend physical description entirely. This is what makes biblical metaphor so powerful. It doesn't mean less than literal language, it means more. The lamb image invites readers to dwell inside it, to feel the injustice, to understand the silence, to grasp what substitutionary suffering actually means. No abstract theological statement could accomplish what this metaphor does. Okay, we have an ancient physiology problem. Okay? But what about metaphors rooted in incorrect literal understanding? Ancient Hebrews attributed emotions to physical organs, the heart for intellect and emotion, the kidneys for moral decision making, the intestines for compassion. We know now that's physiologically wrong. The brain handles all those functions. Does this invalidate the metaphors? No, because the metaphors weren't teaching anatomy. They were using available cultural frameworks to communicate physiological and spiritual realities. The heart served as a cognitive anchor for describing inner human experience. The spiritual truth remains valid even when the physiological basis is inaccurate by modern standards. When Scripture speaks of God examining the heart and kidneys, it's communicating something profound and divine about divine knowledge of human motivation and moral character. The metaphor works within its cultural context. It accomplishes its communicative purpose. Modern readers don't need to believe emotions literally reside in cardiac tissue to grasp what the text is revealing about God's intimate knowledge of human inner life. This is why respecting the ancient cognitive environment matters so much. The biblical writers weren't trying to teach science. They were revealing spiritual truths using the conceptual tools their culture provided. So we have a coherent metaphorical system we need to work with here. Some biblical metaphors aren't isolated images. They form entire systems. The divine council is one example. Across multiple biblical books, you find references to God ruling with a heavenly assembly. Job, Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah all describe the same framework. The imagery is consistent. Heavenly beings described as stars, sons of God, holy ones, a celestial hierarchy under divine authority. This wasn't random poetic flourish. It was a coherent metaphorical system drawn from ancient Near Eastern cosmology. Similar divine council imagery appears in Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Canaanite literature. The Israelites shared this conceptual framework with their neighbors. But here's what makes it coherent rather than arbitrary. The metaphors interact. They reinforce common meanings. They appear consistently across different texts and traditions. They serve a clear theological function, explaining divine governance and cosmic order. Most importantly, they provide interpretive guardrails. Understanding the divine council as a metaphorical system prevents misreading references to gods or stars as endorsing polytheism. Instead, you recognize these as created beings subordinate to Yahweh. The system clarifies individual metaphors within it. This is how coherent metaphorical frameworks work. They're not collections of random images. They're integrated symbolic languages for conceptualizing spiritual realities. Okay, there's a question about authority. Does grounding biblical metaphors in ancient Near Eastern cosmology create problems for biblical authority? Only if you expect Scripture to function as a science textbook. The Bible's purpose is theological, not scientific. It reveals God's nature and purposes, not the physical structure of the cosmos. Ancient cosmology served as the cultural vehicle for revelation, the medium, not the message. When biblical writers described the cosmos in terms of its function and purpose under God's authority, they were doing functional ontology, explaining what things are for, not what they were made of. This is divine accommodation in action. God communicates with the cognitive and cultural context of the recipients, not because God is constrained by human limitations, but because effective communication requires meeting people where they are. John Calvin recognized this principle throughout Scripture. God condescends to human capacity, using language and concepts we can grasp. The metaphorical nature of biblical cosmology doesn't undermine authority. It demonstrates how revelation actually works. God sovereignly chooses to use human language and cultural forms to disclose divine reality. That choice reflects relational intent, not divine limitation. Okay, so we need to prevent arbitrary interpretation. But if everything's metaphorical, doesn't that make interpretation arbitrary? How do you avoid the trap of it's all just metaphor so it can mean whatever I want? Well, several constraints prevent this. First, metaphors exist within the broader biblical narrative. They're not isolated images floating free. They arise from Israel's story and theological tradition. Second, context provides interpretive criteria. The surrounding text frames how a metaphor should be understood. Third, multiple metaphors for God highlight different aspects of divine nature without contradicting each other. Consuming fire and gentle shepherd emphasize different attributes: holiness and judgment versus care and guidance. Together, they create a richer, more nuanced portrait than any single metaphor could. Fourth, interpretation must avoid reducing God to human categories. Metaphors should be read as reality-depicting language that uses human experience to reveal divine truth without collapsing God into mere human terms. These guardrails keep metaphorical interpretation faithful to the biblical message. They prevent it from becoming a free-for-all of subjective meanings. So how reading changes. When people grasp that biblical metaphors are cognitive bridges rather than decorative language, their entire engagement with Scripture transforms. They slow down. They ask questions. They explore multiple layers of meaning. Bible study becomes an active intellectual exercise rather than passive consumption. Readers develop cultural historical awareness. They learn to think like the biblical authors, adopting their metaphorical imagination. This prevents anachronistic readings. It opens access to the original intent in the theological message. Readers also become comfortable holding literal and metaphorical meanings in tension. They recognize both contribute to the full message. This balanced approach avoids rigid literalism on one extreme and dismissive allegorizing on the other. Perhaps most importantly, readers allow biblical imagery to shape how they perceive God, themselves, and the world. Seeing God as rock fosters trust and stability. Chaotic waters evoke awareness of spiritual danger. The metaphors become more than intellectual concepts. They become lived realities that form spiritual understanding and practice. This leads to embodied faith, spiritual truths internalized through the metaphors of Scripture. So, how does this reveal more about Revelation? If metaphor is the only way to bridge the gap between human experience and divine reality, what does that tell us about Revelation itself? It reveals divine accommodation as the fundamental mode of revelation. God chooses to communicate in ways humans can understand. This isn't constraint, it's gracious condensation to human cognitive and linguistic capacity. Metaphorical communication is dynamic and creative. Divine truth expressed through human experience and imagination, guided by the Spirit. The process enables biblical authors to convey divine realities in ways that resonate with their cultural context while inviting ongoing reflection by future readers. Revelation transcends literalism without sacrificing truth. It reveals truths that literal language alone cannot capture. It engages the whole person, mind, heart, imagination. This means revelation is both true and accessible, communicated in forms that respect human finitude while pointing beyond it to divine mystery. God isn't bound by human language, but God sovereignly chooses to use it as a means of self-disclosure. That choice reflects divine desire for relationship and understanding, not incapacity. The use of metaphor highlights the depth and richness of divine revelation. It invites continual exploration rather than final, exhaustive definition. Okay, one thing to remember. For the person reading their Bible at home who's never thought about language this way, here's what changes everything. Biblical metaphors are decorative. They're essential. They're the vital means by which God reveals truths beyond words, the cognitive bridges that make transcendence accessible to finite minds. Once you grasp this, your entire engagement with the Scripture deepens. You stop seeking only literal facts. You start embracing rich, multi-layered meaning. You see Scripture as a living conversation that invites imagination and reflection, not a flat, one-dimensional text. You experience reading as transformative encounter. The metaphors engage your whole person, shaping how you perceive God, yourself, and the world. You're freed from forcing ancient texts into modern categories. You can appreciate the Bible on its own terms, respecting its ancient context and theological depth. The Bible becomes what it always was meant to be, a rich, imaginative journey into the heart of divine reality. It's not a book of rules or facts, but a sophisticated communication from infinite mind to finite minds, using the only language that could possibly work, the language of metaphor. All right. Thanks for sticking through this. If you have any comments or questions, put them in the appropriate section. I will answer all comments appropriately. All right. Also, if you haven't done so, think about subscribing to this channel, liking this video, and sending it to a friend. It helps us a great deal as we're trying to grow and bring this biblical truth to additional people. So thank you for that. Also, if you'd like to get more in-depth knowledge about this stuff, if you're thinking that, boy, I would have loved to attend seminary, but the cost and time was always a problem. Well, time you're going to have to devote to this. This is intense Bible study, right? This is making you a better Christian in your discipleship. But money, that shouldn't be a problem. I have a Bible platform that we use to extend courses and additional details, and we have all kinds of other information on there. I try to do a weekly update on what's new on there. Look for that for more information. It's only $10 a month. I'm trying to keep it as low as possible so that I can support the platform and the cost of building it, but I'm also trying to keep it very, very cost effective for you. So think about that. The link will be in the description if you want to check it out. Thank you very much.